You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It's Thursday, June 26, 2025. It's 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And we've had quite a few requests lately to have me explain the origin of the Mettagroup method for attachment repair that we came up with. And so I thought that I would do that. Um, Interesting. When you talk about the beginning of stories, there's almost an infinite number of places to start. Going all the way back to the glint in my father's eye is probably too far. Thankfully, I don't remember any previous incarnation, so we can't start there. We do teach as a preliminary practice the attachment repair. The reason that we think attachment repair is a good preliminary practice is because the same kind of attachment issues that interfere with exploration interfere with the exploration of the deep spiritual paths. That if you're not a good explorer, it makes it much harder to discover the insights in your spiritual practice that you need to discover in order to come into the place of fruition. And so that it makes sense that you would begin to examine the nature of exploration and also the conditioning that you have around exploration so that you can begin to develop aspects of that you might need that will make the deep insight path more available to you. I also think that it's useful to have a community, and it's also useful to have a relationship with a teacher. And again, the attachment issues that can come up that prevent you forming productive relationships with people can interfere with forming productive relationships in a meditation community, and also can disrupt connecting well with the teacher so that you can have the most benefit out of the relationship with them in terms of the guidance toward deep insight. It is unusual to be able to understand the deeper spiritual insights without a teacher, although it's quite ordinary in the West to really have what we call Dharma orphans, which are people who are very well schooled in understanding and have read a lot about practice and maybe have even practiced in isolation from somebody who would be able to reflect back to them the nature of their practice. I noticed in my own path that it mapped pretty well onto that. I would join communities in high hopes. This is a pattern that went all the way to school. The school year starts. I go in. I'm really looking forward to it, and the difficulties that arose both in being able to emotionally regulate enough to do the work and also to form meaningful relationships always interfered. So it wasn't unnatural for me to be looking for solutions to this that I wasn't able to find outside of the practice of meditation. My introduction to attachment theory wasn't really until the end of the 90s. So this would be 25, 30 years ago. A friend of mine gave me a bootleg CD. Remember CDs? I went to an opening and a release party for a friend of mine's new CD, but I don't have a CD player. I don't even know where you would find one to play it. It's a kind of anachronism. And I actually have one of my early photo projects was a CD, and I probably have 50 copies of it left. I'm thinking, oh, we'll offer them, but does anybody actually have a CD still connected to computer where you could play a video project? It's hilarious. Um, anyway, I put it into my CD player in my car, and I listened to it. It was a lecture that Alan Shore gave in the late 90s on disorganized attachment. And he explained in 10 minutes the entire pattern of my adult life, which was a lot of beginnings, some middles, and almost no finishes. Uh, this is, the pattern that I'd spent 25 years in psychotherapy trying to figure out so that I could do something about it. And it was such a stark, vivid image of the experiences that I had so well articulated by somebody I'd never met who had no real understanding of who I was. And so I immediately thought it would be important to enter into some kind of additional psychotherapy that was more attachment focused. But 30 years ago, really, it wasn't a concept that had permeated culture to the point that I could find anybody who was conversant in it. And so, as a good, well honed, decade long Dharma orphan, I simply decided I would do it on my own, which is pretty much the the response to all of the world's challenges is challenges by a disorganized person. I'll just figure this out on my own. I had embedded myself well enough into Shinzen Young's community, but the thing about Shinzen's community that made it possible for me to do that is the only time that you had interaction with most of the people in the community was on retreat, and you were in silence, which made other people so much more enjoyable than I normally found them. I could look at them and we could interact and be very polite in silence and not get particularly bothered by it. And then you see them a few times a year in that context, and there's a sense of camaraderie without the sense of really who they are beyond that. And I found that the way that he described meditation and the techniques that he offered were quite clear. I had spent a time with other teachers where the instructions were not specific enough that my mind could take them up very well. And a lot of what I had considered meditation in the beginning was more like uncontrolled thinking, where I just monitored my thoughts, and there wasn't much insight beyond that. And so I really appreciated the specificity of Shinzen's instructions. And also, I have an astonishingly high bar for a minimum kindness response in people. And most of the other teachers that I encountered didn't even come close to the level of kindness that I required from somebody. But Shinzen was unfailingly kind, which made it possible for me to engage with him in a way. And he didn't really have an agenda for what my practice should be, which was also something that I noticed in other teachers. They were very particular about how that practice unfolded. And you could hang around, and there was no particular demand, which was also useful for me. And I began to have meditative experiences, which was a nice thing. And I was around while he began to uh, gather up this notion of organizing his teaching, and he developed the see, hear, feel approach, which had not really been part of the earliest experience of his teaching. So very simple instructions that produce a strong meditative experience, a lot of training in what a technique is, but not so much in the way of what to do with the teaching, the map, as you were. How is it that you get to the experiences? Uh, Using that Theravada system of long periods of sitting, so that you move through a lot of the discomforts of early practice and push through them and see that they're not substantial and you don't need to adapt to them. I was a very angry person. It's interesting to talk to people about that. I think if you were around then and you knew me then, you would understand how angry I was and how difficult it was to uh, uh, form relationships with people who had experienced the levels of anger that I carried, because it was frightening. And I would be somebody who was frightening. And when people are capable of frightening you, it's very difficult for you to settle and form uh, a close relationship to them. And that was one of the things that I had noticed about life, that people were often afraid of me, particularly if the eruptions of anger were witnessed. And plus, I was a little bit sardonic in my wit. Mean might be another word you could use. Um, I did work the door at nightclubs in New York for a decade, which really polished my skill at meanness in a few sentences. So it was a requirement of the job. But I decided that I would try to do something about the anger so that I wasn't so frightening to people, and I could move into more dependable relationships. And so I began to sit with the somaticized experience of anger, which is a good object for meditation because it's available and it produces high concentration states. You can go into the jhanas pretty easily working with that as an object. And for me, it was abundant, so it was readily available to work with. And that was actually something that you could do with the techniques. One of the things about Shinzen's world is that it's a lot of these techniques, but then they have to be applied in a certain way. And he doesn't really describe the way that you apply them, but that's meant to come from the relationship with the teacher, so the relationship with him. And I found that he was not as available as I like to have people available to me to learn. And so that was a slower process than I might have wanted. Um, so when I discovered attachment theory and looked around in the psychotherapy world for what might be a good fit there and couldn't find anyone even who was conversant in it, I recognized that certain of the patterns that were described in the psychological literature was actually something that could be fit up well with Shinzen's meditation techniques. And so I began to explore the views or the mind states of attachment as they arose in my own meditation practice. Around that time, so this is probably 25 years ago or so, Shinzen was asking his senior students to start teaching his techniques so that there would be a broader reach for them. And so I started to teach locally in Los Angeles. And initially, I taught his techniques pretty much just as he described them. But what I discovered from the people who came to my classes is that they weren't interested so much in learning Shinzen's techniques from me because they could go to Shinzen, who was also ordinarily in Los Angeles. But what they wanted to learn from me were the experiences that I had in using the meditation techniques to further my insight into the nature of the human condition. And a student came up to me and said that I had been the angriest person that he ever met, and I was no longer angry. And actually, that would be a useful piece of information for him. And so I began to teach a class uh, called Overcoming Anger, which was, I taught at the Santa Monica Zen Center. I'm going to guess in 2003 or something around there, I started to teach that. And it went well. I thought I had the techniques that I had, or the pathways of investigation that I had developed based on Shinzen's techniques. So the investigations that I used to work with that, I was able to teach. But then people came up and said, it isn't anger that's my issue, it's fear that's my issue. Could you teach a class on fear? So I started teaching a class called Overcoming Fear. And then somebody came up to me and said, anger and fear aren't my issues. Sadness is my issue. Could you teach a class on sadness? And so I started to teach a class on overcoming sadness. And then somebody came up to me and said, anger, fear, and sadness, the big three, we like to call them, is not my issue. Shame is my issue. Could you teach a class on shame, which is the gang of four? I mean, these are all things we'd been talking about. And so a light bulb went off on my head, and I thought, man, I'll just teach a class on overcoming difficult emotions, and then everyone can come to the same class, and that worked well. But then people came up to me and said, it's really not the difficult emotions that are the problem. It's the difficult relationships that cause the difficult emotions that are the problem. And then I really understood that actually the thing that people were interested in me teaching them was my exploration around attachment conditioning and how to move out of that experience. And so I began to teach a class called The Meaningful Life. We all have attachment conditioning, and we all come out of childhood with these, in Buddhism, we would call them views, these way of seeing ourselves and the world. And these working models that we develop of ourselves and the working models we develop of the world come from the early attachment relationship with your primary caregiver. In fact, mainly the way that we think of ourselves is the way that we uh, took in our caregiver's experience of us as an infant. That was the basis of our concept of self. This, of course, is years before the development of an autobiographical memory capacity, years before the experience of self, which we talk about quite a bit in meditation circles, arises long before there's a witness to this process that would help you reflect on the way that you've created these working models. They're already operational and well developed by the time we can reflect on them. And so we don't get much contrast, much insight about them. A child's brain, while it's very good at absorbing just an amazing amount of information, it's not good at a cognitive reflection on them. That doesn't even happen until puberty happens. So the first time we're actually able to begin to reflect on the nature of our conditioning is in post-adolescent experience. So late teens, early to mid 20s is really when we're able to begin a meaningful reflection on that. And by then, of course, the conditioning is really embedded. We don't really notice so much unless the family is totally dysfunctional and barely operational, that the way that we learn to resolve conflicts, the way that we learn to be in relationship to other people is unique to our family system, really, until we get outside of that. when we're looking to form, meaningful relationships. Really, we're talking about puberty practically before we get a deep insight into the nature of other people's family operation. We just accept it as how it is. In the Satipatthana Sutta, in the refrain, it says mindfulness of inside, mindfulness of outside, mindfulness of inside and outside, which is really what I think the investigation is when we begin to look at the nature of attachment conditioning. This is the working model of myself, mindfulness of inside. I've created a working model of you, mindfulness of outside. And then the way that I respond affects you, and the way that you respond to me affects me. And that's the mindfulness of inside and mindfulness of outside, that interaction. Can we really examine that to see how our conditioning affects the way that we're able to form relationships? Is that making sense? So it was just such a natural fit to investigate this. I thought that this practice of meditation and watching the way that the sense of self forms in relationship to the meaning that we assign to the present moment, the way that the sense of self reacts to the experience of expression to other people, all of these things. And then having the signposts to understand that. One of the things about attachment theory is that it describes these relationships to self and world, these patterns of relationship that are easy to recognize. The advantage of having a map, and I think this is one of the long disagreements I've had with Shinzen, is the utility of a Dharma map. But he has often expressed that none of the maps are universal, that they are relatable based on your conditioning, and that what he would like is a theory of everything, a single map that was all encompassing. But I'm not nearly as lofty as he is. And I think that you could find a map that makes sense to you, that you could read that's actually good enough. So, but the attachment map was so clear that you could begin to watch the way that you formed the experience of self and world with that overlay, and begin to make sense of the conditioning, particularly because so much of the early conditioning happened before there was any self-reference. We come into the experience of self-reference with an already operating system, already operating way of being. And if there's no contrast, it's very difficult to see what that system is. And in these descriptions of attachment, you begin to see quite clearly the things that are happening. And what also happens is that you have this possibility of letting go of the self-judgment and the self blame for the way that you automatically create the experience of self and world. There's a freedom in that of volition. It's also offering you a deep spiritual insight, is that if you don't have the capacity to watch your conditioning unfold, it simply is the way that you are, and it simply is the way that the world is. And you're in a state of constant reaction to that, rather than being free of the conditioning and being able to respond in a different way. But as it turns out, seeing is not enough, which was also quite an alarming discovery. In the initial formulation that we worked on at Mettagroup, you could call it a two-pillar approach, which was the developing of mentalizing skills and the development of emotional regulation as one aspect, and then the exploration of a coherent narrative around what your conditioning was that led you to where you are now. So one of the traditional pathways in Buddhism is an exploration of karma. And that succession of choices that you make that end you up where you are now, of course, in the cosmology of Buddhism, this goes back to thousands of previous incarnations. But um, I find the complexity of that too much. And so I prefer just to work on the current incarnation. And as Shinzen would say, which I really enjoyed early on with him, why not get stream entry in this lifetime? Uh, why take another 1,000 lifetimes to get there? There was a metaphor that I don't know, I heard quite a bit 30 years ago, which was to find meditation and to practice deeply is like having a life ring floating just randomly on the ocean, and then you, as a sea turtle, just surfacing with no thought and entering inside the ring on the vastness of the ocean. It's so fortunate to discover this practice and have an opportunity to practice that we should grab it. So all I can say is thank God for the Beatles, the White Album, and their finding meditation in the 60s, just at that moment of coming into cultural awareness in my mid-teens. Um, so I like to test things mainly because of, as a gay person in the world, there's so much prejudice and so much uh, sort of crappy behavior that you have to endure that I discovered in work life where there was so much prejudice that hard numbers were your friend and that anything that relied on relationships were not because as a small minority, the discrimination was too easy. And so I like to test things. I like to have numbers to see whether things are working or not. And in talking to people about beginning to recognize and understand your attachment conditioning, and then to attempt to do something about it so that you can come into more functional relationships and prepare your capacity to explore so that you can then go deeply into practice. I wanted to make sure that it worked and not that it was a, a a conversation piece that actually didn't produce much. And so I figured out how to do the AAI by going up to the Institute in Berkeley with Mary Main and Eric Hesse, and I began to do before and after AAIs for the people that took the class. By then, it had evolved into a year-long class. 6 months of describing what the attachment conditioning was, which was the psychoeducation piece, and then 6 months or so around repairing it. The class met for 10 months over a year, typically, is what happened. But what we noticed after about 5 years of doing that is that people were not actually changing that much. The underlying attachment conditioning stayed the same. There was a great benefit to understanding the patterns of relationship that you had. And there was more emotional regulation and better mentalizing, quite a bit better mentalizing. There had been the idea that developing mentalizing alone would be enough to shift people's underlying attachment conditioning. But what we found is that people's mentalizing improved, but it didn't really change the underlying attachment patterns. And so I began to look around for other people that were doing this kind of work. By then, of course, the concept of attachment theory had become more broadly distributed in our culture. Usually, it's 30 to 40 years for an idea to penetrate broadly our culture. And so, while in the late 90s, it had not had much impact by the mid to late 20 teens, there was a bigger dialogue around it. Of course, now it's even 5 or 8 years later, it's quite a bit um, um, routine to encounter, really, I think. But that would be closer to 50 years since the idea was originally presented in the mid 80s, or 40 years. And so looking around, I encountered Dan Brown's work. And what really appealed to me about Dan Brown and his teaching was that he was also an advanced meditation practitioner and teacher. So that there seemed to be a real synergy between a meditation-based approach and the Western psychological approach. And that the one piece that he offered in his approach to repair that we didn't was this remapping of the perceptual database that he did with the ideal parent figure. So Dan and his group developed that over 20 years, more on the therapy side than on the meditation side. So I engaged with Dan, and we developed a dialogue, and he helped me to integrate the ideal parent figure protocol into the existing approach of the mentalization and emotional regulation that was based on meditation practices that were based on Shinzen's work, and then also the psychoeducation, which we did in groups rather than one-on-one. One of the things about Mettagroup and the population that we were originally working with was that they were largely disorganized people. And one of the things that you notice about disorganized people is they're really resource challenged. They have a hard time showing up. They have a hard time showing up reliably. They have a hard time holding jobs. So they are resource challenged. And so we organized our work so that people that were resource challenged weren't excluded from access to the work. So, we ask for uh, um, tuition, but nobody's ever turned away for lack of funds. We still do that. I mean, it's not that we've changed that. And then resource people, if they can contribute a little bit more, do so and help cover the cost for people that don't have resources. That has held up over the years as a good way of doing it. So doing the group trainings, which is the psychoeducation piece, and also training the meditation piece so that the mentalizing and emotional regulation can develop with the capacity to hold, the capacity to mentalize better what's actually happening in the dynamics of the relationship, and then also to be able to regulate much more intense emotions means that the capacity to work through conflict in relationships increases. One of the things that is apparent in a lot of these insecure and disorganized attachment systems is that the conflict resolution strategies are cumbersome and not so effective, and so that you use up a lot of energy in trying to resolve conflict, but you also uh, burn up relationships in trying to resolve conflicts when you can't resolve it. A way of just who did.
Sorry, not to go too off track. Are you talking about disorganized people reliably showing up? I was wondering why is them showing up or keeping their jobs, other things that are related with attachment? Because I feel like there's no person involved in that case.
Well, most of the time when you work, there is a social environment that you need to be able to manage in order to be effective in working. And in order to do the work, you need to have your exploration system on and your attachment system off. So it's like a toggle. The attachment system is engaged, it deactivates the exploration system. So that when you're in a work environment and you have conflict with people, it activates the attachment system and deactivates the exploration system. So it makes working harder. If you don't have good systems for emotional regulation and you don't have reliable relationships that can help you deactivate the attachment system, and the work environment is challenging for you, what you find is that in the beginning you're able to function pretty well in the work environment, but the more challenging, that is to say, the more activating of the attachment system the work environment becomes, the less able you're to do the job because your exploration system is less available to you. The other part about it is that when you become too dysregulated as a disorganized person, the way that you ordinarily regulate is by socially isolating them. You begin to not come into work in order to regulate yourself to the point that you could come into work, and the absenteeism then affects your teammates' willingness to trust you with part of the load that needs to be carried in the work environment, and so you begin to be uh, given less and less responsibility to the point where people would just rather have somebody else do it. That's what usually happens.
So them not showing up is because of their emotional dysregulation because of some another person in the company or some other person, not.
Some interaction, yeah, typically.
But if they don't have that, they will show up.
They can, yes.
Right.
So then what you also find is that they end up in jobs where whether they show up or not is not so important. But jobs that where you show up or not is not so important are not jobs that have a lot of responsibility to them. They're jobs that anybody could do. And so early in your work life, that isn't such an issue. But as you get older, then all of a sudden you're much older than the people are also given the jobs that it doesn't matter whether you show up or not. And that can, we tend to go with the people that are around our age. And as our generation moves ahead in terms of positions of authority or responsibility, and we're left behind by that, younger people are also not so interested in pulling us up with them. They're more interested in pulling up their own peer group. And so you can get quite disadvantaged in terms of the development of your work life.
So sorry, last thing is, so a person is not disorganized all the time. He's disorganized part of the time when that thing happens.
Disorganization is specifically defined in this, which is that the attachment response in disorganized people is unpredictable because it doesn't just manifest routinely. So a secure person manifests a secure attachment response. Insecurely attached people, say dismissing people or helplessly preoccupied people, when their attachment system goes off, they manifest dismissing strategies or they manifest helplessly preoccupied strategies. In a disorganized person, particularly a complexly disorganized person, they could be secure, they could be dismissing, they could be preoccupied and you cannot reasonably predict what the attachment response is going to be from your interaction with them. Why this becomes a problem is because we need to be able to learn how somebody else communicates, what their meaning, their definitions are, so that when we express something to them, we can express it in terms that they're likely to understand, so that we can predict how they're going to respond to it. So we predict how we have to express something to them so that you can be in an exchange of information. And when somebody is disorganized and you can't reasonably predict how they're going to respond, you can't formulate a way of presenting a conflict to them that you can then manage well. And so then what most people do is then they begin to withdraw from attempting to engage in conflict with them because it's so unpredictable how they'll react. And if you can't resolve a conflict with somebody, the relationships come apart. So
So
that's
it's not like they're walking around with disorganized attachment all the time. It's only in those periods of conflict with some other person is when the attachment system turns on.
activates.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Not like it's all on all the time.
right. And then it's also hard to figure out what to do for yourself if you can't predict how you're going to react attachment-wise. What strategies you then need to use to be able to get yourself to settle so that your exploration system can turn back on and then you can undertake the task that's in front of you. If you're constantly in a activated state, it's very hard to explore, which means it's very hard to solve problems, which means you have to have work that doesn't require much in the way of exploration and problem solving. So you're more into a kind of rote task thing.
So not exploration, but conflict, right?
Conflict.
Not exploration itself, because a person who's by himself can still be good in exploration as long as there's no other person involved.
Right. So that makes it easier.
Yeah.
But then, people more on the avoidance side are good explorers alone, whereas people on the preoccupied side are not good explorers and they're not good alone. They need proximity, and so they're more likely to work in groups where there's an environment, and they're good at. One of the ways that they survive in group endeavors is that they don't need to explore if somebody's telling them what to do. And so they function well in environments where somebody else's agenda is the thing that they're implementing. They're good at implementing it and they're good at doing somebody else's plan, but they're not good at making their own plan or discovering what needs to happen. So at Mettagroup, we integrated the ideal parent figure into our other two pillars. So the meditation and emotional regulation strategy, we've developed a series of meditations that are designed to help you developmentalizing and designed to help you emotionally regulate. We use the early framework of mentalizing that Anthony Bateman and Peter Fonagy developed at Tavistock. We use the conflict resolution strategies framework that was developed by Lebowski, and we use the schema inventory and that framework, which was developed by Young in New York, as a map. And then I've really designed these meditation techniques, or the use of Shinzen's meditation techniques in these investigations that are meant to illustrate for you those solutions. And so I think that actually we've spent 20 years on it and it actually works really well. And so when you engage with us, we have a 90-hour meditation training that will improve your mentalized and emotional regulation. And we actually have a good sense that it works because it shows up on the AAI in terms of the mentalizing scores. And then the psychoeducation that we use is really takes you through the history of attachment theory, the Bowlby, Ainsworth piece, and also the later work that was done by Mary Main up at Berkeley with Eric Hesse. And so that you have a framework of understanding how this operates. And then when you put all three of these things together, you come through the level 1, level 2, and do the meditation training and the psychoeducation on attachment. You have that basis that you can then go into level 3 and level 4 to do the individual ideal parent figure work, to repair or remap the database on how relationships are supposed to go. Level 3 is for people who have insecure, disorganized attachment. So the focus there is earning security. And then level 4 is people that have a native secure attachment with features, we like to say, or people who have earned security that then can look at developing secure functioning relationships and also to develop primary exploration. So the exploration around purpose or the meaningfulness of life. A lot of people develop skills for secondary exploration, which is the gathering of time, energy, and resources, but not that primary push into the meaning or the purpose of your life. So that's what the focus there is. We have a level 5. Sometimes when you're in doing the attachment work and you make these fundamental changes to the way that you operate in the attachment world, existing relationships need to be renegotiated because you are changing the agreements from insecure, disorganized operation to more secure. And sometimes it's hard to renegotiate that. And so level 5 is helping to renegotiate relationships where possible. And then level 6 is intermediate and advanced mentalizing, which we look at as exploration oriented. And that's really where we return to this idea of going deeply into your meditation practice. Once you're able to develop the mentalizing capacity to really explore deeply meditation pathways, and once you're able to form relationships with people that will support you in this deeper dive, it makes the investigation toward enlightenment much more realistic, might be a way to say it, much more possible. So that's our approach. Questions about any of that? You should do some practice too. Would you like to do loving kindness or insight? Or I suppose ideal parent figure. 3? Door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3? It's a goat wearing a tire. All right. We'll do ideal parent figure. So Lucy, do you want to do some too? Yes. Yeah, about. Oh, here she is. Lucy. Lucy. All right. So go ahead and settle in. Now let the scene fade. Finding your way out of there, I'll count from 5 to 1. When I reach 1, you'll be fully present, fully awake. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Fully awake, settled in the experience. How's that? Good. So tomorrow is Friday, and we have Kaleidoscope, our monthly meeting that's from 11 to 12:30. It's essentially a Q&A, but we do always have a topic. Let's see what that topic might be. Oh, fun. How to navigate sex. That's our topic for tomorrow. So it should be invigorating at least. And then Saturday, we're having the Advanced Mentalizing Exploration course, and I'll talk about uh, creative work in a way as a form of getting exploration going, obviously. And there's a lot of different pathways for exploration, a lot of different pathways for uh, expression of that. Looking at the calendar, we have a meditation and attachment level 2 class starting on Thursday afternoons on January 3rd. Some from 4:30 to 6:30, so that's coming up. And then we're going to start a level 1 attachment series on July 12th. So for 3 Saturdays, we'll do that. In August on the 9th, we're going to begin a level 1 attachment addiction course, and that will go for 3 Saturdays through the end of August. We're going to do the exploration workshops again in September on the 13th and on the 20th. And then we're going to begin meditation and level 2 course on the 15th of September, which meets 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 6 to 7 Pacific time. And that runs for 12 weeks. And then we are actually into the fall, and we'll talk about the fall later. This is just what's coming up this summer. I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope if you're resourced and you can, you'll make a donation. There's a link on the website to do it. Any amount is helpful. It's helps support me and also the work Mettagroup is doing. I really appreciate your practice. It's lovely to see you, and I hope to see you soon somewhere along the path. See you. Bye.